Welcome again to this virtual space of learning. Today we're going to talk about Sigmund Freud. And I want to give a disclaimer before we begin on Sigmund Freud that I have strong opinions on Sigmund Freud's theory of personality. So you're going to hear a lot of my opinion on his theory of personality throughout this presentation. So I wanted to start with just giving you some context on where Sigmund Freud's theory of personality developed, because every theory of personality, even our own theory of personality of ourselves, right, comes from our family of origin, from our culture, from our upbringing, like the environment that we were raised in. And the different environments that we found ourselves in growing up. And so all of this influences the way we think about ourselves. And so, of course, with Sigmund Freud, that is the same case. And so Sigmund Freud, he grew up in Europe, and he was raised in a Jewish family. And they use the word adorn his mother, but I would dare to say that he was probably slightly infatuated by his mother. He developed an addiction to cocaine, and he's known as the father of Western Eurocentric theory of personality. So as you see, he's known as the father of the theory of personality, but I added Western Eurocentric theory of personality because I think that it's important to clarify that Sigmund Freud's theory of personality is based off of being a white European male from a Western thought. And as you know, if you have viewed my global point of view on theories of personality, that there are different thoughts. There are Eastern thoughts, there are African-centered thoughts, there are indigenous thoughts on why we are the way that we are, who we become, that is far removed from the Western's point of view. Okay, so Freud felt like our structure of our personality was the id, the ego, and the superego. And this chart right here, this visual kind of gives you an ideal of how he felt like it played out. He felt like the superego and the id was unconscious and that the ego was conscious, right? And he felt like our ego was how we connected the conscious. It's how we interact and how we connected to the world around us. He felt like the super ego and the id were like they still played a role. How do I explain this? We can have things that are subconscious that we are not aware of that are playing out in our conscious and how we're interacting in the world, if that makes sense. And so what I mean by that, like the superego, which according to Freud's theory of personality is like your moral self, right? Like your high self. And then your id was like your pleasure self. And so the ego in his thoughts kind of balanced the two, right? To make sure that one didn't become more extreme than the other. Okay, and so when you're thinking about Freud's theory or the structure of personality, right, is the id, the superego, and the ego, right? Well, he felt like there were different stages of development when this plays out. And if you notice with Freud's theory of personality development, it is very sexual. A lot of Freud's theory had a lot to do with sexual frustration, sexual urges, sexual frustration, which this is sidebar my opinion. I wonder if in his home he was not allowed to freely explore his sexuality. probably didn't have a safe place to talk about his sexuality. And so because of that, I feel he had a lot of built up tension with his sexuality. His father could have been the same way. As you know, he grew up in a Jewish home, and it could have been a very strict conservative Jewish home, which is why he became atheist, right? And so maybe the father was the same way. Maybe he felt like the way he saw the dynamics between his mom and his father, and how that relationship played out. All of these things could have played a role, but Freud had a lot of his theory was centered around sexual urges, sexual frustration, and he felt like it began at birth, from birth to one. And as you can see, like oral, and you can even see like with the terminology that he uses, right, to describe the stages of personality and development. So like, for example, the oral, he felt like that was the beginning of the id, and where there's just this pleasure in being able to suck on everything. When you think about babies, like they love to suck on everything. And then as he progressed through the stages of development, he saw the next stage as anal. And this is where he felt like, you know, when you are just defecating, right? Like when you, and how like toilet training removes that pleasure and that freedom, or gratification to just be able to defecate. Again, I find his theory very strange, as far as his theory of how personalities develop. I find his theory very strange, because I tend to gravitate more towards a globalist point of view of personality. I have to consider my ethnicity, and how that plays a major role in how I view oneself. And so because of my ethnicity, which is more geared towards an Eastern point of view, his point of view is so far removed from me, because I don't believe that our basis of humanity or who we are is all about this sexual frustration and this fight to balance that. You know, I just disagree with that, and I don't believe that that is the center of our stages of development and becoming, you know, growing up. Okay, so the next stage is where his Oedipus complex comes in, right? And this is the complex where he believes that you begin to have, the male begins to have sexual fantasies and like an adornment, an infatuation to the mother. And because of this, there's this sexual tension, because you are frustrated that you can't act on these fantasies and urges. And then there is a tension towards the father who can. All right. So he feels like this begins to happen around 4 or 5. And then he feels like the next stage is where you are able to act on these sexual instincts, and not so much with the mother, but where you're just able to release these sexual instincts. And then you continue to develop that into adolescence and adulthood, where you're able to freely explore your sexual identity. And so again, Freud's theory is his theory of personality is based heavily on psychosexual stages, and how he felt like your sex organ, your sex identity, your sexual urges, like all of this was the foundation of who you are. And that played out in your id, your superego, and your ego. Okay, so his questions about human nature, he basically felt like the goal in life is to reduce this tension. And again, you know, we talked about what that tension is, right? And he felt like there was universality in that. Like we all struggle with that. Again, sidebar, when he talks about universality, you have to keep in mind that he's talking about, you have to keep in mind the context that he's talking about where he's from and who he is. So he's talking about universality among white European males. He felt like personality was determined by early childhood interactions. Again, he had a strong basis in just nature. And so like where you were raised and who you were in childhood pretty much becomes the basis of how you maneuver through life. But he felt like psychoanalysis could create free will. And so basically from analyzing yourself, analyzing these urges and this tension within you, you could create free will. Free will being like fully aware of yourself, fully content with yourself, fully able to just be who you are. That's what I mean by free will. Okay, so in Freud's theory, two techniques that were heavily used in a therapy session utilizing his theory were free association and dream analysis. And so with free association, it was basically say whatever comes to mind. And so if you think about the classic picture of the person laying on the couch and then the therapist is sitting in the chair and they have this notepad and the person is just talking. And so this was his form of therapy. Just say what comes to mind. And that through that, the expression of emotions expected to reduce symptoms problems. And so what he felt like is if you just say what you will, say the emotions, say what's on your mind, just let it out, then you would feel better. And I have to say that I do find that psychoanalysis, I want to separate Freud's theory, Freud's psychoanalytic theory from what psychoanalysis is. Because those are two separate things, but so often they're grouped in the conversation about psychoanalysis or psychodynamic. That's another term that's used. That's a more modern term that's used now for this form of therapy. But psychoanalysis is basically when you are analyzing a person's past to present, and then you are connecting that analyzation to a theory, right? To a theory of personality, to a theory of development. That's what psychoanalysis is. And so in saying that, I think that there is some validity to free association and dream analysis. However, when we talk about how psychoanalysis is the analyzation and then the connecting that analyzation right to a theory, you have to be mindful of whose theory they're connecting it to, right? And so again, I go back to that global point of view. And so if I'm in a therapy session as a client, right, and I am doing free association and I'm just talking, if I'm with a African-centered therapist, then the theory that they're connecting, the theory of self, the theory of development that they're connecting to what I'm saying would look different than if I was sitting with someone, let's say a white male who was utilizing Freud's theory. So I just want to make sure that that's clear when we're talking about psychoanalysis. We're wrapping up psychoanalysis now. You know, we've gone through the Neo-Freudians, and now we're ending with Sigmund Freud, which is pretty much who is predominantly talked about in the literature when we talk about psychoanalytic approaches. But I can't reiterate enough that psychoanalytic approaches are not just their point of view or their theory on psychoanalysis. You know, there are other theories out there. There are other global point of views on analyzing a person's past to present. So with dream analysis, he felt like dreams show repressed desires, fears, and conflicts. And again, the dream analysis and free association are two ways to allow people to to allow in a session to analyze a person's past to present. But Freud's theory on what's coming out of a dream analysis, or how Freud is analyzing a dream and how Freud is analyzing your free association, is what we're talking about now. But the dream analysis is something that's done, you know, in all forms of therapy, but have a different theory onto what your dreams may mean. The same with free association, where someone is just able to freely talk. But with Freud's theory, he felt like with dreams that it was a reflection of desires, fears, and conflicts. Because remember, he felt like your super ego and your id were unconscious, right? And so he felt like in dreams that was revealing what was unconscious. And the same with free association. He felt like it was bringing up the unconscious, which was that part of you that's your super ego, that part of you that is your id. So the research in Freud's theory, Freud relied heavily on case study, which I feel like a lot of the theorists do, because a lot of what you learn comes in the form of what you see happening in a therapy setting, which again, you have to keep in mind, who was Freud seeing, right? So again, he was in Europe, right? You got to think about the time of when he was practicing. During that time, you know, there was oppression of the black, the brown, the indigenous, and people of color. And so he was not seeing people of color. So he was predominantly, or if not predominantly, but seeing white males and probably white females. And so when you think about the case studies, how he was forming his literature, his research, it was based off of that population. So there was a lot of conflict. There's a lot of conflict and a lot of debunking of Freud's theory now. But there was also a lot of conflict with his theory then, because it was so heavily based on case studies. But there are some parts of research that some research that has been done that does support some of Freud's concepts, which is the influence of the unconscious, the displacement, repression, denial, and projection. Basically is this defense mechanisms, you know, that we talked about in some of the other theorists as well. Like, defense mechanisms are ways of us to be able to suppress what we really feel inside of us. And so there has been research that supports that. And then also this influence of the unconscious. So again, like when we talk about what research has shown support of, they link it to Freud's concepts, but remember, Freud has a concept about the unconscious, but just the generality of influence of the unconscious is not a Freud's concept. Like, a global point of view, there's always been this view that our unconscious influences us, right? And how to become more aware of what is unconscious, right? To bring that to conscious, to bring that to full awareness. So I would not say that is like Freud's concept. Freud has a concept on how he views the unconscious, right? And then the same with defense mechanisms. Like, there are other points of views on how defense mechanisms play out in us. But Freud had a concept on that. And remember, his had a lot to do with like this defense mechanisms, and the unconscious had a lot to do with like tension within us, sexual tension, sexual urges, sexual frustrations. Some other research that supports Freud's concept was dreams as a reflection of emotional concerns. So again, I reiterate, Freud is not the father of how dreams reflect things. Freud has a theory on what dreams are reflecting. And then also the Freudian slip, which, you know, they have I don't know if you guys have ever heard this before, but they say when somebody is drunk, that's when they're telling the truth. That's what a Freudian slip is, like how it's when we accidentally say something, when it like comes out, like it wasn't supposed to come out, but it is the truth. That it's a truth within you that came out, that needs to be explored. So these are some concepts that Freud had a theory around. Again, I want to reiterate, these are concepts that are universal concepts that people have theories on, but Freud had a theory on it as well, and research supports, I wouldn't say Freud's concept of it, but research supports that the validity of this, like that we are influenced by our unconscious, that we do have defense mechanisms that play out when we are in denial of our true self, our true feeling, and that dreams are a reflection of our emotional concerns. Our dreams are a reflection of life within itself, right? And that we do sometimes have the slip of the tongue. Okay, so let's reflect. What are your thoughts on Freud? Do you agree or disagree with his theory? Are there any parts of his theory that you feel you could use? I have found that there are parts of psychoanalysis that I feel are useful, but as far as Sigmund Freud's theory on how he's analyzing, because again, psychoanalysis is analyzing someone's past to present and then connecting it to a theory. And so for me, I just disagree that our whole life is based around sexual urges and frustrations. I think that he was speaking more towards himself as a white European male, and I think that there are things that maybe for others that come from that population that maybe could explore a little bit more in his theory. But for me as a Black woman from African descent, I do not see any of his theory resonating with me. However, the psychoanalysis, which came before Freud, I think there is a lot that you can gain from analyzing one's past to present and how, that's playing out in your well-being. So what are your reflections? I think that it's important as you are learning these theories that you formulate your own reflection. You formulate your own thoughts. You keep in context who you are, right, as an individual in your culture and your background and your family of origin, so that you are, as you are matriculating through, whether you're in undergrad or graduate school, that you are taking the pieces that resonate with you, connecting them to who you are, and then you're actually formulating a theory, right? And that theory is what you will be using when you are using a form of psychoanalysis in a counseling session. So those are all of my thoughts on Sigmund Freud. My next lesson that I will do, we will begin to explore other theories of personality. Erik Erikson, I guess because that's the next one that I'm going to do. I guess he's kind of like, I guess you could say he's kind of like in the middle, because he I don't know, I would be interested to hear what your thoughts are. He's not, they don't have him with psychoanalysis, but they don't have him with, behavior, or cognitive behavior, or social either. They kind of just have him in the middle. Maybe because his theory is more like a development theory. I don't know. But neither here or there. That's another lecture and presentation. I thank you for your time and attention. I hope that these lectures are of use to you. as you are matriculating through school, or if you're just here to just learn more about theories of personality.